In the 1940s, Alan Ladd rose to become one of Hollywood's biggest stars, an outcome that seemed almost impossible given his early life. His journey to fame was anything but easy, filled with hardship and pain, both physical and emotional. Yet despite these struggles, Ladd carved out a legendary career, leaving behind a legacy that is both remarkable and deeply tragic. Misfortune struck early in Ladd's life. In 1917, when he was just 4 years old, he suffered a devastating loss. His father, whom he was named after, collapsed from a fatal heart attack. This sudden tragedy left Ladd and his mother to fend for themselves, marking the beginning of a life filled with hardship and uncertainty. But heartbreak wasn't the only challenge that came his way. Not long after his father's passing, disaster struck again, this time at Ladd's own hands. Like a scene out of a cautionary tale, he accidentally set fire to their apartment building while playing with matches. Forced to flee their home, his mother had no choice but to take him and move elsewhere, setting them on a path of instability that would have lasting effects on Ladd's future. His childhood was defined by constant upheaval and struggle. In the early 1920s, his family moved to California in search of a better life, but the journey itself was grueling. Ladd later recalled how hunger was a constant companion, as they often didn't have enough food to eat. The experience was so harsh that he compared it to The Grapes of Wrath, John Steinbeck's famous novel about the struggles of impoverished families during the Great Depression. Unfortunately, the hardships didn't end when they reached their new home. Instead, they followed him into his school years, where he faced yet another kind of torment. Starting over in a new town was never easy, and Ladd found himself struggling to fit in. Having already fallen behind in school due to frequent moves, he was older than most of his classmates, but despite his age, he was noticeably small for his grade, a result of malnourishment and hardship. His peers took advantage of this and gave him a cruel nickname, Tiny. The taunting over his size became relentless, a painful reminder of his struggles. This insecurity would follow him into adulthood, shaping the way he saw himself and his place in the world. However, during those difficult school years, there was at least one silver lining, something that would eventually pave the way for his remarkable rise to fame. Things finally seemed to be turning around for Ladd during high school, at least for a brief moment. By the time he was 16, he had grown stronger, and his athletic abilities shone in swimming and diving. His talent even earned him awards, fueling his ambition to compete in the Olympics. But just as he set his sights on that dream, disaster struck again. During a practice session, he suffered a severe head injury, abruptly cutting short his athletic aspirations. The setback was crushing, but in a strange twist of fate, this disappointment steered him toward his true calling. With his Olympic dreams behind him, Ladd found his way into the entertainment industry, though not in the way he had imagined. He landed a job as a grip at Warner Brothers, a position that gave him a behind-the-scenes look at filmmaking, but his streak of bad luck wasn't over yet. Not long after starting, he fell from a scaffold and injured himself. The accident immediately brought back the painful memory of his swimming mishap, and the emotional toll was too much to bear. Unable to shake the trauma, he quit the job. Still, he couldn't completely walk away from Hollywood. Instead, he decided to take a different approach. He would step in front of the camera. Ladd's determination to act was unwavering, but Hollywood wasn't exactly welcoming. Studios repeatedly turned him down, citing a reason that must have felt both baffling and frustrating: his appearance. His blonde hair and fair complexion didn't translate well on screen, making casting directors hesitant to take a chance on him. Even Universal Pictures, after initially signing him, dropped him within 6 months, deeming him too blonde. It was yet another blow, but Ladd wasn't one to give up easily. If his looks were holding him back, then he needed to focus on what he could control, his craft. Determined to prove himself, he scraped together enough money, borrowing when necessary, to enroll in acting school. But much like his early years in California, the experience proved to be disheartening. His teacher wasn't impressed, criticizing him for being too quiet and insisting that his voice was too high for leading roles. It was yet another hurdle in a life already filled with them. But if there was one thing Ladd had learned through all his struggles, it was how to adapt. If his voice was a problem, then he would change it. No matter how many obstacles stood in his way, he was determined to find a way forward. Ladd refused to let criticism define him. Instead of being discouraged by his acting teacher's harsh words, he turned them into fuel for his ambition. Determined to improve, he worked tirelessly to transform his voice, training it until it became deep and commanding. His efforts paid off. He found steady work as a radio actor where his rich voice became his greatest asset. It was his first real break in the entertainment industry, the starting line of a long journey towards stardom. But while his professional life was finally gaining traction, his personal life was unraveling. In 1936, Ladd married his high school sweetheart, Jane Midge Harold. However, their early years as husband and wife were anything but smooth. Financial struggles kept them from living together at first, forcing them to spend the first year of their marriage apart. By 1937, they managed to move in together, but only by sharing an apartment with a friend. Hardly an ideal situation for a newlywed couple. As difficult as that was, it would soon pale in comparison to the much bigger troubles heading Ladd's way. His mother, Ina Raleigh, had endured her own series of heartbreaks, and over the years they took a devastating toll on her. After losing Ladd's father, she remarried a house painter named Jim Beavers. Only for tragedy to strike again, Beavers passed away, leaving her alone once more. Then in 1937, she suffered another painful breakup. This final blow seemed to push her over the edge. As she moved in with Ladd and his wife, her behavior grew increasingly erratic and self-destructive. The situation spiraled out of control until one fateful day, everything took a tragic turn. On November 29, 1937, Raleigh asked Ladd for money, claiming she needed to buy something from the store. Ladd, knowing his mother's struggles with alcohol, assumed she simply wanted more booze. Without much thought, he handed her the money. Of all the poor decisions he would make in his lifetime, this one would haunt him the most. Just as Ladd was beginning to find his footing in the entertainment industry, his life took a devastating turn. The money he had casually given his mother ended up sealing her fate. Instead of using it for alcohol, as he had assumed, she purchased ant poison. Then, in a heartbreaking act of despair, she climbed into the back seat of his car, consumed the poison, and ended her life. But the nightmare didn't stop there. Ladd himself was the one who discovered her lifeless body. The gruesome sight of his mother's final moments would haunt him for the rest of his life. He knew she had suffered terribly, and the weight of that knowledge stayed with him, a wound that never fully healed. Now, orphaned and grieving, he had no choice but to push forward, carrying his trauma with him as he tried to rebuild his life. But the losses kept coming. Only a few years later, in 1941, Ladd's marriage to Midge fell apart. The high school sweethearts had one child together, but ultimately, their relationship couldn't withstand the pressures of life. Just as he was coming to terms with losing one of the most important women in his life, another one slipped away. However, fate had other plans, and it wasn't long before someone new entered the picture, someone who would change the course of his career forever. That someone was Sue Carroll, a former actress turned talent agent. She first encountered Ladd not in person, but through his voice. While listening to the radio, She heard him seamlessly switching between the roles of a father and son in a performance. Impressed by his ability to embody both characters, she immediately wanted to meet him. That meeting would prove to be far more than just a career opportunity. It was the beginning of something much bigger. Sue Carroll wasn't just another woman in Ladd's life. She was a powerful ally. As a former silent film actress turned talent agent, she had years of experience and industry connections that Ladd desperately needed. Seeing his potential, she quickly signed him to her agency and took on the role of his personal advocate, pushing his name into the spotlight. Her influence paid off, and before long, Ladd's career was on the rise. A few years later, their professional relationship became personal when they married. However, whether their union was built on love or convenience remains a mystery, especially in light of Ladd's infamous affair later in life. Under Carroll's guidance, Ladd finally landed the role that made him a star. In This Gun for Hire, 1942, he played Raven, a ruthless contract killer with an unexpectedly soft side. He loved cats, was gentle with children, and carried a tragic past. This complex, morally ambiguous character captivated audiences and critics alike, establishing Ladd as a leading man. From that moment on, Hollywood couldn't get enough of him, and the roles kept pouring in. But his time in the spotlight wasn't without its dangers. Ladd frequently starred in film noirs and westerns, genres known for their intense action sequences. While filming The Glass Key, 1942, a fight scene with co-star William Bendix took an unexpected turn. Bendix was supposed to throw a fake punch, but he miscalculated and accidentally landed a real brutal blow to Ladd's head, knocking him unconscious. For once in Ladd's life, however, a painful accident led to something positive. Bendix, feeling awful about what had happened, apologized repeatedly. His genuine remorse struck a chord with Ladd, who wasn't used to such earnest gestures of friendship. Despite his typically reserved nature, Ladd formed an unlikely bond with Bendix, proving that even in the cutthroat world of Hollywood, true friendships could emerge in the most unexpected ways. Ladd didn't just play gangsters, he reinvented them. Before him, movie criminals were rough, gaudy, and unrefined. But Ladd brought something new to the role: charm, sophistication, and undeniable appeal. As the New York Times later put it, he was the one responsible for replacing the old-fashioned, rough-edged gangster with a suave, well-dressed, and dangerously charismatic bad guy. Throughout the 1940s, Ladd dominated the screen, becoming one of Hollywood's most sought-after leading men. But just as he was reaching his peak, World War II threatened to derail everything. One of Ladd's greatest strengths as an actor was his chemistry with his co-stars, particularly with Veronica Lake. The two were paired in 4 films, creating one of the most iconic on-screen duos of the era. Ladd's cool, collected, and quietly intense characters played perfectly against Lake's seductive femme fatale roles, making them a winning combination at the box office. But while their professional partnership seemed like a match made in Hollywood heaven, there was another, more practical reason they kept getting cast together. Ladd had battled insecurities about his size since childhood, and even as a Hollywood star, his height remained a major obstacle. Standing at 5 feet 6 inches, he was considered too short for a leading man. That's where Veronica Lake came in. At just 4 feet 11 inches, she was one of the few actresses who made Ladd appear taller on screen. When she wasn't available, however, film crews had to get creative. Directors and set designers went to great lengths to compensate for Ladd's height, building ramps, digging trenches, and even arranging specific camera angles to make him look taller than his female co-stars. While he had managed to overcome criticisms about his looks, voice, and presence, The constant scrutiny over his height only deepened his insecurities. Over time, the pressure and self-doubt took a heavy toll, one that would have devastating consequences. At the height of his fame, Ladd's career was briefly interrupted when he was drafted into the Army in 1943. However, instead of being sent to the front lines, he was assigned to the United States Army Air Force's 1st Motion Picture Unit, a division responsible for producing propaganda and training films for the military. Though far from traditional combat, it was still a service to the country. But as it turned out, his time in the Army wouldn't last long. Later that same year, Ladd received an honorable discharge due to severe stomach and digestive issues. By the time his health had improved, the draft had ended, allowing him to return to Hollywood without ever seeing active duty. Though he had avoided the battlefield, he couldn't escape one of his biggest lifelong struggles, his own insecurities. Despite his rising stardom, Ladd had a reputation for being distant and difficult to approach. Actress Loretta Young, who worked with him in 1943, described him as intensely serious, noting that she never once saw him laugh. Off camera, he remained withdrawn, making it nearly impossible for co-stars to connect with him. But Young also noticed something else: Ladd's deep-rooted self-consciousness. His low self-esteem didn't just affect his personal life, it seeped into his performances as well. Young recalled that while filming, Ladd would only look at the camera from certain angles because he believed he didn't look good otherwise. It was a stark contrast to the confident, tough guy roles he played on screen. While Hollywood sold him as a heartthrob behind the scenes, he struggled with his own reflection. Ladd wasn't just humble, his self-esteem was practically non-existent. He often spoke about himself in a way that revealed just how little confidence he had in his own success. His most famous remark summed it up perfectly. "I have the face of an aging choir boy and the build of an undernourished featherweight. If you can figure out my success on the screen, you're a better man than I." This relentless self-deprecation wasn't just a quirk. It was a deep-seated insecurity that sometimes led him to make questionable decisions, both in his career and his personal life. One of those decisions came in 1945, when he clashed with Paramount Pictures, the very studio responsible for his rise to fame. Frustrated with his salary, Ladd demanded a pay increase, but instead of negotiating, the studio hit back hard. In August of that year, he refused to report to set, and Paramount wasted no time suspending him. They didn't stop there. They even recast his role in the film he had been working on, making it clear that they wouldn't bow to his demands. Eventually, both sides reached a truce, but the ordeal came at a price. Even after the dispute was settled, Ladd never felt secure in his position. While Paramount agreed to increase his salary, they also rejected his request to work with other studios, effectively keeping him on a tight leash. Ladd, fearful of pushing too hard and losing everything, chose not to fight back. He believed that once a star was out of the spotlight, they were forgotten. "When a star's off the screen, he's dead," he once said. Desperate to maintain his relevance, he took a leap into unfamiliar territory, one that would prove to be a major misstep. In an attempt to break free from his usual tough guy roles, Ladd took on the lead role in The Great Gatsby, playing the enigmatic Jay Gatsby in the 1949 adaptation of F. Scott Fitzgerald's classic novel. Paramount, however, wasn't convinced he was the right fit, and as it turned out, they were right to be nervous. The film was a major disappointment, failing to connect with audiences and earning lukewarm reviews. Ladd's performance, in particular, exposed a glaring weakness: his struggle with emotionally complex roles. The film's failure only reinforced what Hollywood already suspected. Ladd was great at playing hardened, brooding anti-heroes, but when it came to stepping outside that comfort zone, he faltered. Ladd's on-screen persona as a sharp-dressed, brooding anti-hero was undeniably popular, but Paramount wanted more from him, specifically more romance. They pushed him to bring out a flirtatious charm, hoping he could channel the same magnetism as other leading men of the era. But no matter how hard they tried, it just wasn't in him. Ladd remained stiff, overly serious, and deeply cynical, making romantic chemistry nearly impossible. Even his co-stars found it difficult to connect with him both on and off the set. For someone who built a career playing fearless gunmen, Ladd had one unexpected weakness. He was terrified of firearms. His fear became especially obvious during Shane, where he had to perform a scene demonstrating expert marksmanship. The reality? He had to close his eyes just to fire the gun, and it took an unbelievable 116 takes to get the shot right. Ironically, despite his discomfort around weapons, a gun would later play a role in one of the most dangerous incidents of his life. Regardless of his struggles, Ladd's dedication to his work was undeniable. He never let injuries or illness stop him from filming, pushing himself through pain and exhaustion without complaint. In 1954, while working on 2 back-to-back movies, he powered through despite severe injuries and infections. While his commitment was impressive, it also revealed something troubling. He had little regard for his own well-being. And it wasn't just his body he neglected. As his career declined, his mental health deteriorated just as quickly, leading him down an increasingly dangerous path. Ladd's accident-prone nature only made matters worse. Just before filming the McConnell story, he slipped in the shower and broke a rib, one of many injuries in a long line of misfortunes. In fact, he seemed to be constantly battling some kind of physical setback. The year before, he had injured his hand badly on one film, only to suffer from a severe infection during the next. Whether it was bad luck or sheer recklessness, Ladd was a walking disaster. But did any of these setbacks stop him from working? Not a chance. While filming the McConnell story in 1955, Ladd's on-screen marriage with co-star June Allison turned into something much more complicated behind the scenes. The two began an affair, and Ladd quickly found himself deeply in love. However, despite their intense connection, their romance was doomed from the start. While Ladd was willing to leave his wife Sue Carroll for Allison, she didn't share the same feelings. Allison's heart belonged to her husband, Dick Powell, and she had no intention of leaving him. To make things even more complicated, both she and Ladd had children with their respective spouses, making any possibility of a future together even more unlikely. In the end, Ladd was forced to accept defeat. Heartbroken, he and Allison denied all rumors of their relationship, not wanting to cause further pain to their families. But as painful as this breakup was, it was just another layer of misfortune in Ladd's already troubled life. Not long after, he witnessed yet another tragedy, this time on set. While filming Hell on Frisco Bay in the late 1950s, production was already off to a rough start. Ladd had been recovering from chickenpox, delaying filming, while his co-star Edward G. Robinson was struggling with personal family issues. But nothing could have prepared them for what happened next. During a fight scene, stuntman Louis Tomey, who was standing in for Robinson, suffered a severe head injury. The accident proved fatal, and Ladd was once again faced with the harsh reality of death. This marked the third time he had witnessed a tragic loss firsthand, and unfortunately, it wouldn't be the last. As the 1950s faded into the 1960s, Ladd's career took a sharp downturn, and his poor choices only made things worse. His long-standing contract with Paramount ended, forcing him into the uncertain world of independent filmmaking. Without the guidance of a major studio, his already shaky instincts for choosing roles became a major liability. Time and time again, he passed on projects that could have revitalized his career, leaving him with nothing but missed opportunities and lingering regret. Ladd's poor decision-making continued to sabotage his career. He turned down roles that could have revived his stardom, opportunities that others seized and turned into major successes. One of his biggest missteps was rejecting a supporting role in Giant, 1956, simply because it wasn't the lead. That part ultimately went to James Dean, who made history with the film. Another major role he passed on was in The Sons of Katie Elder, which ended up in the hands of none other than John Wayne. As Ladd watched these films soar without him, the weight of his declining career pressed down harder. His mental health was unraveling, but despite his struggles, he still found opportunities, just not in Hollywood. In the 1950s, Ladd took on a project in the UK, but stepping into a British World War II film as an American actor was a risky move. Many British audiences resented the Hollywood narrative that Americans had single-handedly won the war, and Ladd found himself facing skepticism. Rather than risk alienating viewers, he came up with a creative, if somewhat desperate, solution. To smooth things over, Ladd publicly stated that his character wasn't American but Canadian, a clever way of aligning himself with the British Commonwealth instead. He even made a point to clarify, "The story is of a Canadian who joins the British paratroopers in order to learn, not teach the job. All the big decisions in the film are made by the British." The attempt to appease the audience was obvious, but even so, his time in the UK didn't lead to lasting success. And when he returned home, his personal demons were waiting for him. Ladd's struggles with insomnia had plagued him for years, but now he relied heavily on alcohol and prescription drugs just to get through the night. His battle with addiction, something that had followed him for most of his life, was growing worse. In many ways, he was following the same destructive path as his mother, using substances to numb the pain. But with his career fading and his inner turmoil intensifying, the road ahead was leading toward an inevitable, tragic end. Ladd's struggles with his self-image never faded, no matter how much success he achieved. He had spent his entire career battling insecurities about his looks, and by the 1960s, his self-loathing had only intensified. In a 1961 interview, when asked, "What would you change about yourself if you could?" his response was blunt and heartbreaking. Everything. No matter how many films he starred in or how many fans adored him, his fragile ego remained untouched by fame. A year later, in 1962, Ladd's inner turmoil nearly led to tragedy. He was found in his home, collapsed in a pool of his own blood, with a bullet lodged dangerously close to his heart. The shot had pierced his lungs, ricocheted off his rib cage, and miraculously missed his vital organs. When authorities arrived at the gruesome scene, they feared the worst. Many believed Ladd had tried to take his own life. But when questioned, Ladd had a different story. He claimed that he had suspected a burglar was in his house, so he grabbed his gun and went searching. In a bizarre turn of events, he said he tripped, causing the firearm to discharge and accidentally shoot him in the chest. While officers accepted his explanation, suspicions lingered. Given Ladd's history of depression and his growing dependence on alcohol, many believed that this so-called accident was, in reality, a failed suicide attempt. As his personal life unraveled, his acting career was also nearing its end. His final role came in 1964, playing Nevada Smith in The Carpetbaggers, a character whose story felt eerily familiar. In the film, Smith gains fame for playing cowboy roles in westerns, only to watch his career fade into obscurity. The parallel to Ladd's own life was impossible to ignore. His days as a Hollywood leading man were behind him, and like his character, he was forced to face the harsh reality of a career in decline. But that wasn't the only tragic similarity. Despite the eerie parallels between the Carpetbaggers and Ladd's own fading career, the film turned out to be a massive success. It ranked as the fourth highest grossing movie of 1964, proving that Ladd still had a place in Hollywood. His portrayal of Nevada Smith was so well received that a prequel centered around the character was quickly put into development. It seemed like Ladd was on the verge of a long overdue comeback, but just as the tide appeared to be turning in his favor, tragedy struck once again, this time for the last time. In January 1964, Alan Ladd's life came to a heartbreaking end. He was found unresponsive, having accidentally overdosed due to a fatal mix of alcohol and sleeping pills, substances he had relied on for years to cope with his insomnia. The official cause of death was cerebral edema, and at just 50 years old, Ladd was gone far too soon. His struggles with self-doubt, addiction, and personal demons had followed him to the very end. But while his life was filled with hardship, his impact on Hollywood was undeniable. Beyond his own career, Ladd left behind something even more enduring: his family's legacy in the entertainment industry. His son, David Ladd, later reflected on how deeply embedded their family became in Hollywood, saying, "It's like living in Detroit and working in the auto business." The Ladd name continued to shape the industry long after Alan was gone. In recognition of their contributions, Variety even referred to them as a true dynasty in Hollywood. Though Alan Ladd's life was marked by struggle, his influence lived on, securing his place in film history.